Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Pingdom and Textastic. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John Voorhees. How are you?
Oh, I am doing very well, thank you. What should we talk about this week, Federico? I feel like we've seen so many changes this summer in the core apps on iOS that I wanted to talk, instead of talking about a particular app today, I thought maybe we should talk about some things that are a little bigger picture and maybe talk about third parties competing with Apple's apps that are built into the system. What do you think?
That's a good topic. I feel like till a few years ago, in the summer when I was testing a beta of a new version of iOS, I always, for obvious reasons, I always ended up switching to the Apple built-in apps. And until a few years ago, I would say, oh, this time I'm totally sticking to the Apple version. And then by September or October, when third-party developers updated their own third-party apps, I ended up going back to them. But I feel like, especially in the past couple of years, this sort of goes back to an article that I published last year on Mac Stories called The Comfort of Apple's Ecosystem. Over the past couple of years, I've actually started sticking to those Apple apps. And especially, I think, in the past year, as I've started using reminders and I was already using notes, that idea of maybe I shouldn't use third-party apps anymore because I have an incentive and I have all of these benefits by using the Apple built-in apps, that has become really so much stronger than before. And I think this is a fun idea for an episode because Mac Stories, we do review third-party apps. We love third-party developers, but we also need to face the reality, I think, that the native Apple offerings for certain key categories of apps on the iPhone and the iPad have gotten a lot better compared to, say, the days of iOS 7 or iOS 8. And so I think it's gonna be a fun conversation, and I'm intrigued to hear what's your take on all of this.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely the case. I think that the built-in apps have gotten a lot better over the past few years. And I really do feel like Notes was where this all started because, if you back up maybe 5 years ago or so, there was, I think there was pretty much conventional wisdom among app developers that one way to succeed in the App Store was to follow Apple's lead in a category, in an app that Apple creates for 80% of people, and then take that idea to a more pro user audience and make it for the 100%, add features, do something better, have more depth and that sort of thing. And I just feel like that has gotten a lot harder, especially with certain apps. And I think Notes is a very good example and probably the earliest example that I can think of. But I think Reminders, starting really a little bit last year, but mostly this year with iOS 13, has been a big change. But even when you look at things like podcasts was at one time a really pretty bad app. I mean, at least compared to the third-party podcast apps that we've reviewed for years, like, Pocket Casts and Overcast and Castro and a whole bunch of others that were, superior in lots of ways to Apple's app. But that app has slowly but surely gotten a lot better over the years. And then even looking at things like, the Calculator app. The Calculator app for Apple has always just been on the iPhone, but now it's coming to the watch. And, our friend James Thompson makes pCalc. And one of the things that set pCalc apart is that it's available on all sorts of platforms. And now we see Apple expanding that a little bit. I think, James probably still has an advantage on things like customizability and a lot of the scientific calculation stuff that's available in that app. But Calculator hadn't really changed hardly at all since the beginning of the App Store. And now it's starting to spread its wings a little bit as well. So I feel like this is a changing thing, but I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things I want to get your take on is, on the one hand, I see these apps becoming deeper and richer with features that Apple makes. On the other, though, some of the features that we're seeing are also working their way back to third-party developers. Notes, for instance, has had these rich links in it for a while now, and that wasn't open to third parties. But on iOS 13, that is. So it's like that was first in Notes. In iOS 13, it's also, I guess it was in Messages too. It's coming to Reminders. And as it broadens and comes out to more apps in Apple's system of apps, it's also at that point coming to third-party apps, which is a good thing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel as though the window for competing with Apple kind of against its own apps is a lot harder and narrower than it used to be.
Yeah, especially because I think on one hand, the argument for using Apple apps was always, well, they're free, they are built in, so there's everybody has them. You don't need to go to the App Store and find an alternative. You can trust them because Apple cares about your privacy, and they can do things like iCloud sync in the background, so they're usually faster to use or more reliable. But I feel like in iOS 13, we're seeing a lot of features, like specific exclusive features that only Apple apps can access, and that it's very likely that third-party developers will never be able to implement, or that if they will be able to, it's going to be in a few years, and maybe not to the same extent of the Apple versions. So let me give you a few examples. In Reminders, in the new Reminders app, there's a new Siri suggestions feature. And this is because the reminders can natively integrate with Siri intelligence on your device. And once Siri picks up what it thinks could be a task for you, whether it's from a calendar event or an iMessage conversation, you're going to see a special list, a special section in the Reminders app that says Siri suggestions, and it's going to suggest a reminder to you based on what it thinks it found. Recently, we were talking on iMessage, and you told me to do something or to remember to do something. And when I opened Reminders, there was a Siri suggestion for me right there. And all I needed to do was actually save the reminder, and the title and the time and everything else was already filled in, which I thought was impressive. And it's exactly the kind of feature that it's very possible that unless Apple opens it up, it's never going to be available in a third-party app. You're never going to see a third-party app be able to communicate directly with Siri to this extent. Another example, something that I just discovered in iOS 13, Apple has figured out a way for users to create tasks, so to create reminders, with the same deep links to other apps that you could do before, but only if you used the hands-free Siri activation and then said, remind me about this.
Right.
In iOS 13, you can do this with the share sheet. So, for example, if you select the subject of an email message in the Mail app, and then you hit the share button and you share to the Reminders extension, the reminder that you create will have a little mail icon. That icon is a deep link to that email message. So it's sort of like having a share sheet in Mail finally. You can actually create tasks from Mail, but it's only supported for Reminders. And as I did more research around this, it turns out that the Reminders extension can actually receive these deep links, which are technically based on the NS User Activity API, from all apps that support that framework. So if you are, I don't know, Deliveries or Safari or maybe even Twitter, and you support NS User Activity, which is a framework that does a lot of things in iOS. Once you share from those apps to the share sheet and select the Reminders extension, your reminder will have a deep link to that activity so that you can tap the icon and go back to a specific web page or a specific delivery or a specific tweet or profile page. And that stuff is really impressive, and it's something that developers cannot do.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Textastic. Textastic is a code editor for your iPad and iPhone. Look no further than this app for your iOS code editing needs. The app has syntax highlighting for more than 80 programming and markup languages. I was scrolling through the list today, and Textastic has you covered with everything from C to Objective-C and Swift. There's JavaScript, Python, YAML, HTML, CSS, and dozens more. Of course, it's compatible with Markdown too. Not only can you write in Markdown, but you can preview Markdown with the app's built-in web server or preview it in Safari. Textastic is also compatible with Sublime Text and TextMate syntax definitions, and you can even create your very own. There's a lot more going on with this app, though. You can manage files with FTP, SFTP, WebDAV, Dropbox, and Google Drive, too. There's even a full-featured SSH terminal built right in, which is terrific. You can open multiple files and SSH terminal connections in tabs, too. With robust search and replace that supports regular expressions, keyboard shortcuts that are customizable, and support for Git repositories using working copy, Textastic is one of the most powerful text editors you'll find anywhere, period. Textastic is a great iOS citizen too, supporting features like the Files app, drag and drop, printing, iCloud Drive, Split View, and a whole lot more. Moreover, you can be confident using Textastic because the app is continually updated and supported. Textastic was recently updated to version 8, which tells you something about how often it's been updated because there aren't many iOS apps that are on a version 8. There are so many more cool things Textastic does. To learn more, I want you to head on over to their website at textasticapp.com. That's TEXTASTICAPP.com. Again, that's textastic.com to learn more about this amazing code editor for your iPad and iPhone. Our thanks to Textastic for their support of App Stories. It is really impressive. And I tried that with Spark and it worked there as well. And it's part of, I guess, when you talk about Siri, I know I was reading some speculation recently about whether Apple is working on a Siri OS. And I kind of scratched my head and thought about what would a Siri OS look like. And I think the point of that is opening it up to third parties. And maybe, what we're seeing are these initial tests. Sometimes that's why this is a difficult thing to figure out, because sometimes what you're seeing in Apple's apps are tests of APIs that eventually are going to be opened up to third parties. And it may take longer than developers want them to get out into the public, but they eventually do. In other cases, though, they kind of stay behind the scenes and are private APIs that give those apps something of an advantage. And I think that this is a more relevant topic today more than ever because, we just saw earlier, I guess it was like a week and a half ago, we saw an article written by someone at the Wall Street Journal that was investigating whether when you do searches on the App Store, whether Apple's apps are preferred to third-party apps. And in a lot of ways, I didn't find that article particularly compelling. But the point is that there's a lot more focus on Apple in terms of its power in the app ecosystem, whether that's as a matter of search and its business relationships with third-party developers, or whether that's antitrust, competitive type things with the EU or the US and other governments around the world. There's a lot more scrutiny of how Apple behaves in terms of its relationship with the public and third-party developers than there ever has been. And so I think that these kinds of tests of APIs and rollouts to third parties and the ones that are sometimes kept behind the curtain as private APIs, those become more relevant in some of those discussions in 2019 than they were maybe 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some people maybe take this, and this gets political really quickly, but
right.
Some people take it to the extreme. I'm not so sure that it would be preferable to have a scenario where you buy an iPhone and you don't have any Apple apps pre-installed, in the name of competition. You buy an iPhone, you have no apps. You need to go to the App Store and download apps from everybody. There's an argument to be made that maybe Apple shouldn't advertise its own apps so heavily when you search for like browser in the App Store. There's an argument to be made for users being able to select different defaults on an iOS device. But also, on the other hand, we criticized Apple for years for not allowing us to delete pre-installed apps. And when Apple shipped the feature, they personally, I think, wisely decided that a way for users to get back those apps was going to the App Store and downloading them again, because that's where people expect to find apps. And so now you go to the App Store and you can re-download reminders or re-download mail. Is that an unfair, anti-competitive advantage? I'm not sure. I'm not a policymaker. I just write iOS reviews. But I think it's a very fine line between enabling exclusive features because the platform vendor and because the smartphone maker is the same company and they can integrate the hardware and software, and saying, well, this is actually an anti-competitive behavior. I think most people actually appreciate the fact that, Siri can do things that, for example, the Google Assistant app wouldn't be able to do on an iPhone by default. Then again, I'm not a US representative.
Right.
So I'll leave that to policymakers. I bet this is gonna be one of the hot topics for you guys in the US with the upcoming elections.
Yeah, I think it will be. I mean, it's one of those things where I think a lot of the lines are hard to draw just because there's definitely a difference between OS features and apps. And there probably ought to be a different treatment for those two things. But yeah, look, the reality is that most people who buy an iPhone don't download a lot of third-party apps. I mean, that's just the reality. There are millions and millions of people worldwide buying iPhones, and most of them are perfectly content with Apple's apps. And if they didn't offer a core functionality of apps, people wouldn't buy iPhones. Yep. I mean, it would be a phone that would be like, what do I do with this thing? I mean, that's just not something that most people do, unlike us, what we do and what a lot of our readers and listeners do. So I agree. I don't think that saying there should be no Apple apps on a phone when you buy it makes any sense. On the other hand, it is interesting to contemplate some of these features and think about where they fit when you talk about third-party apps. And I suppose it's in a lot of ways where the App Store has been going for a lot of years. It's definitely harder now to make a living as a third-party developer on the App Store than it ever has been. And that's a multifaceted, there are a lot of reasons for that. It's not just that Apple's apps are getting better, but there's more competition among the third-party apps, and there's never been more apps on the App Store than before. So yeah, it's a hard question, but I think it's an interesting one to look at just because there's been such a especially in the last 2 years, such an increase in improvements of Apple's core apps. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pingdom from our friends at SolarWinds. It's summertime, and before you pack your bags and set your email to out of office, you need something to tell you that everything's running smoothly on your site. And more importantly, when it's not, you need Pingdom. Pingdom will help you know the moment your site goes down in whatever way is best for you. You can customize how you're alerted and who gets alerted, depending on the severity of the outage. That way, when you're out of office, you can stay out of office. Take a vacation with peace of mind while Pingdom is monitoring your website. It's easy to get started. All Pingdom needs is your URL, and they'll take care of the rest. Go to pingdom.com/OOO right now for a free 14-day trial. No credit card required. Then, when you sign up, use the code AppStories at checkout to get a cool 30% off your first invoice. And for a limited time only, you can enter for a chance to win a free out-of-office t-shirt by going to that same URL, pingdom.com/OOO. This shirt is really funny. Go check it out at pingdom.com/OOO. Our thanks to Pingdom for their support of this show.
Speaking of Apple apps, let me give you a few more examples for reminders before I talk about podcasts, which I think has also a few interesting details. Reminders has a new URL field. You mentioned the rich links that are now supported in iOS 13. It appears that field, the URL field that generates the rich links, is not available. As of beta 4, is not available via EventKit, which is the calendar and reminders framework for developers. So it's not clear if Apple will open it up, but I think I saw a tweet from the developer of Good Task, which is an excellent reminders client, that the URL field it can be read by the app. So that seems to be exclusive to reminders. Also exclusive to reminders, I think, are going to be subtasks, which are new in iOS 13. You can break up a reminder into multiple tasks contained within the same reminder, as are the new all-day reminders. So reminders with a date, but without a time. I think in third-party clients, those reminders just show up as being due at midnight.
Right.
Whereas in reality, in the reminders app, they are just shown as due Tuesday or Friday without an actual time. So a few limitations for third-party developers and a bunch of exclusive options that are only available in the Apple app. And tell you the truth, I've been using reminders as my task manager since June, and it's only gotten better throughout the beta phase. And I actually like all of these exclusive additions, and I'm probably going to stick to it. But we'll talk about it again in September. Podcasts, as you mentioned, used to be a really, really bad app. I remember when it used to have the skeuomorphic, what was it called? Like the tape.
Yes.
You remember that UI?
It was like a reel-to-reel tape, which was pretty hilarious.
Now it's more in line with the modern Apple aesthetic. It sort of looks like the music app. And for the past year and a half, the Podcasts app has had a few advantages worth noting. It's got full support for AirPlay 2. So faster streaming and the ability to stream audio to multiple devices at once, but also in truly independent playback on the HomePod. From your iPhone in Control Center, you can connect to a HomePod using the audio tiles, and you can start a podcast or, of course, music directly from the HomePod. Without having to do, the iPhone streaming to the HomePod. The HomePod can actually play a podcast episode or a song or a playlist on its own. So I don't think this is available to third-party developers at all. Of course, Podcast has had a full Siri integration for a while. New in iOS 13, shortcuts actions. So shortcuts can now get the full list of your podcast library, get specific episodes for a specific show, and start playback. Third-party developers could probably build these actions. I guess the Marco, for example, will with Overcast at some point. But then again, in September, if you update to iOS 13, you get the built-in Shortcuts app, and that app will have built-in podcast actions just ready for you. I've been using this in my car. I wrote about it in Club Mac Stories 2 weeks ago. They work really well. They're fast, they work. When you start playing an episode with shortcuts, it picks up from where you left off in the main podcast app. And of course, Podcasts is also on Apple Watch now.
Yeah, no, it's quite a year, I think, for iOS 13 and these new features. It's made me rethink a lot, especially with reminders. It's made me rethink what I'm going to use for a task manager in the fall. I'm not quite there yet, but that's in part because I'm a little behind you in terms of adopting iOS 13 on all my devices, so I haven't been using it day to day. But I see the attraction to using reminders. It's definitely been improved a lot, which I'm sure that it's like any category of apps, though. There are things that OmniFocus and Things and Todoist and Good Task and everything do that won't be able to be done by Apple's Reminders app. And it'll be one of those situations where you just have to kind of figure out which of those features and what functionality is critical to the way you work.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I was taking a look at the apps on my home screen, for example, and I realized that especially over the past year, there's a lot of Apple apps in here. And it's probably a combination of the fact that maybe I don't need advanced features as much as I used to until a few years ago. Maybe it's the fact that my responsibilities have shifted. And so I don't do app reviews as much as I used to, especially, of course, in the summer when I'm working on my iOS reviews. But I've been fine using notes and reminders and podcasts. And I've been trying Mail because of the reminders integration. And sure, I do miss Spark. I still keep Spark on my devices for sharing and comments with the Mac Stories team, because honestly, I don't think Mail is ever going to get the sharing feature.
Right.
But at my personal sort of email client that I used to actually manage my email without the sharing functionalities, it's all right. It's not great. It's not as fast as Gmail or Spark, but the reminders integration is amazing and it works really well. And it allows me to clean up my inbox more quickly because I can just make certain messages as, turn them into reminders and archive them. And then even if I tap the link in reminders, it goes back to the email message, even if it's been archived. So it's a great way to sort of triage my inbox. I think overall, the reality that third-party apps and third-party developers are facing is that Apple apps are getting better. And not only better in terms of new features or new designs. That's happening. It's been happening for a couple of years, ever since Apple launched the San Francisco font, and they've sort of started unifying the design in the post-iOS 7 era, which is even more apparent in iOS 13 than before. They've been doing that, and they've been adding features, they've been redesigning apps, but there's more to that. And I think Apple, in the past couple of years, has learned how to take advantage of its ecosystem better and to embed those advantages into the daily experiences that folks have with Apple apps. And that is how you get the exclusive HomePod functionalities with Apple Music and Apple Podcasts. That is how you get this integration between Siri and reminders and S user activity in iOS 13. That is how you get the Shortcuts app, which is now built into the operating system. And it's got native support for things like reminders or notes or podcasts or music. So I think there's more to Apple apps than just the advantages that for several years we just took for granted. Sure, they do iCloud Sync at the background, they have a consistent design, and they are free and built into the system. I think now we also should pay attention to the role of the ecosystem and services that Apple apps are, embedding and showing. Another excellent example, if you use stocks, and don't make fun of it, a lot of people use stocks, but you can have Apple News integration for business news and business articles within stocks. So I think Apple has learned how to leverage its services and its ecosystem of multiple devices, AirPods, HomePod, Apple Watch, and make the most out of that ecosystem by adding exclusive functionalities and integrations that go beyond just, doing iCloud Sync or a consistent design. And that has been really fascinating to observe.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. And I would just add that I think part of what we're seeing is that Apple's always been really good at integrating software and hardware. But I think what we're starting to see is that they're getting a lot better at integrating software with other software now too, right? It's not just a bunch of standalone apps that are running on top of an operating system. It's an operating system and apps that are tightly integrated with one another. And for third-party developers, what I think that means is that whereas, there was a day when kind of following Apple's lead with apps and doing a better job was one way to succeed, that's probably not going to work as well as it has in the past, and that now it's going to be tougher. I think a lot of developers are going to have to do the leading themselves and find holes in the app ecosystem where Apple isn't playing and where there's value to be added to users. And that's, I guess, just the reality of where we stand 11 years into the App Store at this point. All right, Federico, that was a good conversation. I think it'll be interesting to see where things go in the fall. I know there are a lot of developers who have a lot of interesting ideas of where to take things with iOS 13, and I'm eager to see where people go with all the new APIs that are available, especially since that's the way I think now to compete more with Apple than to simply kind of add on to what what Apple was already doing with their own apps. I want to thank our sponsors again for today's episode. That's Pingdom and Textastic. And Federico and I are, of course, over at MacStories.net. You can find us both on Twitter and Instagram, where Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.